What we're looking at here is footage from the Russian Ministry of Defense, which you can tell from the coat of arms up the top right of the screen. What it's showing us is an Su-34 fighter bomber preparing for takeoff at an airfield in an undisclosed part of Russia, and slung under its wings are the weapons it will use for this mission. 4 deadly little devices known as glide bombs. The bomber is headed for Ukraine to attack a command center somewhere in southern Donetsk. These weapons are the latest to be deployed in Russia's war on Ukraine. They can weigh up to 1.5 tons, fly up to 40 miles, and explode with such force that they can level buildings, blow up bunkers, and leave survivors with brain injuries. If we come in for a closer look, we can see these actually aren't brand new weapons at all. They're old weapons with a new piece of kit attached. The old bit is the bomb itself, in this case an FAB 500 M62. FAB is an acronym translating to High Explosive Aviation Bomb. The 500 indicates the weight, in this case 500 kilograms, but they come in both smaller and bigger sizes. The smallest weigh 250 kgs, and the largest ones currently in use weigh 1,500 or 1.5 tons. But Russia is working on even bigger ones, up to 3 tons. And 62 indicates the year it was made, in this case 1962, when the Soviet Union was still in charge. Originally, this was a dumb bomb, which doesn't mean that it came last in its class in school. It means it isn't guided, like a smart bomb, and was designed to be dropped from a bomber straight downwards onto a target below. But not anymore, which is where the new part comes in. Because strapped to this bomb, like a backpack, is what Russia calls a Universal Planning and Correction Module, or UMPK for short. It contains a GPS tracker, which allows the Russians to program it to hit targets that the bomber pilot cannot see, fins on the tail to steer it and stabilize it, and 2 pop-out wings which allow it to glide for miles before smashing into the target and exploding. Right now, the bombs are strapped to hard points under the jet's wings with the UMPK facing downwards. But if you watch this moment, the pilots release the bombs and they roll over, so the kit is facing upwards. The wings then pop out and the GPS takes over, meaning the bombs will glide to their target, in this case a Ukrainian command post, before slamming into it. That means the Russian pilots don't have to cross into Ukrainian airspace during the bombing run, where they might get shot down. But you can see them firing flares here, just to make sure. Because these bombs are packed with huge amounts of explosives, the damage they cause when they hit can be extreme. They're not as accurate as guided missiles or artillery, so they're no use against mobile targets, but they can easily demolish multi-story buildings and reinforce bunkers. Bombs just like these were used heavily in the final days of the fight for Avdiivka, which Russia eventually captured. Glide bombs may be a new feature in Russia's war in Ukraine, but they've got a legacy that stretches all the way back to the Second World War. The very first glide bombs to be used were developed by the Nazis. The Fritz X was a 1,400 kilogram armor-piercing bomb that was converted into a guided bomb by fitting a radio control unit to the tail and fins on the side. It was designed to destroy ships, which were so heavily defended the bombers couldn't get near them, but was slow and large enough for the glide bombs to target. The USS Savannah was badly damaged by Fritz bombs during the Allied attack on Salerno in Italy in 1943, along with Britain's HMS Warspite. An Italian warship Roma, which was in the process of surrendering to the Allies at the time, was blown to bits. Though the weapon did not prove decisive for the Nazis, the idea caught on, and by the end of the war, America and Japan had their own versions, while Britain and the Soviets were trying to develop them. The role of attacking ships would eventually be taken over by missiles, but glide bombs found another use in attacking heavily defended ground targets. One of the most common in use today is the JDAM, which stands for Joint Direct Attack Munition because it was jointly developed by the US Air Force and Navy. It looks a little bit like the Russian UMPK, but more sophisticated, and consists of a tail section which replaces the bomb's old fins at the back and contains the GPS guidance system. There's also a strake kit, which sits around the body of the bomb and helps stabilize it in the air. It has been used in dozens of wars, including the Afghan War, Iraq War, Libya, Syria, and by the IDF against Hamas in Gaza. All these conflicts have one thing in common. They involve countries with large air forces attacking terror groups with few anti-air defences, but which were hidden among civilians. Bombing was therefore a low-risk, high-reward strategy, but the bombs needed to be accurate enough to avoid the civilians. Missiles would have worked, but they cost multiple millions of dollars each and are targeting equipment worth a fraction of that, which is where the glide bombs come in. They proved adept at destroying buildings, bunkers, and bases, and did so at a fraction of the cost of using guided missiles. In late 2022, the JDAM was also given to Ukraine. The Ukrainians got a version called the JDAM ER, or Extended Range, which features pop-out wings that triple the distance it can fly. It was used for the first time in early 2023 during the Battle of Bakhmut. Just like in the Middle East, the bomb proved adept at destroying hardened targets like bunkers and buildings the Russians were hiding in. And it could do so with enough accuracy to avoid hitting people still in the city or nearby Ukrainian troops. The tactic was not decisive, and Ukraine eventually lost Bakhmut, but it was effective enough that Russia began copying it. Putin's generals are now using their own glide bombs to demolish Ukrainian defences and help their troops advance, all while trying to avoid the bloodbath that Bakhmut became. The bombs helped decide the Battle of Avdiivka in favour of the Russians. The question now is, can Ukraine find a way to stop them, or will they lead to yet more Russian advances? That's all the information I got from watching this tape, but I wanted to know more, so I brought the footage to an expert.
Looks like 4 Fab 500, so 500 kilogram bombs with UPMK wing kits, so glide bomb kits attached to a Sukhoi 34M. So this is a Russian fighter bomber. Closest equivalent would probably be the Western F-15E Strike Eagle. This is the kind of one of the 2 standard platforms that the Russians use regularly for dropping glide bombs and also launching other standoff air-to-ground munitions towards Ukrainian lines. Interestingly, they're seem to be going at a relatively horizontal angle. So starting quite high suggests they're quite a long way from the lines, so very high altitude. The 4 bombs released there in a salvo, deploying their wing kits. Looks like a UAV feed for the impact. Russians have essentially struggled to find a particularly impactful way to use the majority of their fighter fleets since the start of the war, because they've not been able to gain air superiority over Ukraine, because they've not been able to find, suppress and destroy those Ukrainian ground-based air defense systems, so the SAM systems. There's limits to how many targets you can hit if they're, for example, relying on air-launched cruise missiles. Those are very, very expensive. They can only hit fixed targets. Russia's been using lots and lots of air-launched cruise missiles from its bomber fleet anyway. So the fighters have had a limited impact there. In terms of closer range missiles with TV or laser guidance, that requires the launch aircraft to get close and therefore has led to losses in for example, their Sukhoi 34 fleet from Ukrainian SAMs. What the glide bombs have given them is a way to use a stock of munitions of which they have huge quantities. So the Fab series of 500 kilogram and 1,500 kilograms, very heavy demolition bombs essentially. They have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these weapons dating back to probably pre-Vietnam. And so they're essentially free. They don't cost much. By attaching these UPMK wing kits to them, and then launching from a high altitude and speed with a fighter or a fighter bomber, they can essentially bombard fixed locations, particularly in areas where the Ukrainians are dug in a salient. So for example, as we saw in Avdiivka before the withdrawal. So where the Russians, the mission planning is pretty easy, they know exactly where they're targeting, so they can essentially just pump out sorties with these wing kit equipped glide bombs at a low cost with a very heavy weight of explosive for each impact compared to an artillery shell.
Launching these bombs back from the front line seems like a huge advantage, but what I wanted to know is what happens when the glide kit fails over Russian territory.
The fuses on the Fab adaptations will be pretty rudimentary. So at the point where the bomb is released, it will be live. And so if the glide kit fails, or it doesn't reach its target and falls short, there will be a large hole somewhere, possibly in Russian-occupied territory. And we have consistently seen Russian air-launched munitions failures resulting in weapons dropping on Russian soil as well as Russian-occupied territory. So, for example, there have been a number of KH-101 series air-launched cruise missiles being dropped from Russian bombers, fired from Russian bombers over Russia itself, which have failed and have fallen in Russian territory and been photographed and released on Telegram and things. That's one of the reasons why, particularly early on in the war, the Russian bombers were often flying a very long way to launch over the Caspian Sea and flying these longer routes for the missiles, presumably so that if the motor didn't fire on the cruise missile, then it was going to fall into the sea rather than fall on land. It's possible to overstate these difficulties, partly because the Russians don't really care if a few bombs fall in the wrong place, even if they were to kill a few Russian soldiers or Ukrainian civilians in Russian-occupied territory. That's not going to result in any inquiries in the Russian system. They don't really mind. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to effectively defend against these glide bombs on the front lines because the Russians can launch from far enough back. While Ukraine has had some successes in essentially ambushing these high-level glide bomb attacking flights with putting Patriot launchers very close to the front lines and the radar relatively close to the front lines, in order to essentially come on at the right moment and rapidly engage those Russian aircraft as they come in at high level, quite far back, where they think they're safe. Ukraine has also lost 2 Patriot launchers, which, to a UAV which found them and directed a ballistic missile in. Essentially, it is very risky with extremely scarce assets that are desperately needed to defend Ukrainian cities, power infrastructure, factories. So it's not a sustainable answer across the front. It's a way to impose some losses on the Russians sometimes and keep them relatively far back, but it's not the answer. The only other real answers are to go after the aircraft on the ground, so to conduct attacks on Russian air bases, with UAVs, special forces. Much more easily said than done. Other way of approaching this, and I think this is where probably Western efforts should focus if they're looking specifically at countering glide bombs, because it will also help counter a load of other things, is more operational level or even tactical level electronic warfare equipment to essentially jam and degrade the GPS and GLONASS signals which the bombs rely on for their guidance. It won't stop the bombs, but you can significantly degrade their level of accuracy to the point where they're not particularly effective.
But did the glide bombs decide the Battle of Avdiivka in favor of the Russians?
I don't think that the glide bombs were decisive in the Ukrainian decision to withdraw from Avdiivka. I mean, the biggest problem that they've had is simply shortage of ammunition for artillery and barrels. And that fundamentally comes down to the freezing of US large-scale aid and the failure of European countries to invest in sufficient production capacity for ammunition in 2022. But essentially, the shortage of artillery ammunition led to far more of the Russian infantry assaults, and it was mostly vehicles taking infantry to kind of step-off points relatively close to Ukrainian lines, and then infantry making those assaults. If you have lots of artillery ammunition, as Ukraine had through most of last year, then you can break up those assaults, inflict huge amounts of casualties, but also crucially suppress and kind of force them to spread out. What was happening for most of the beginning of this year, January, February, and through a lot of March, is that a lot more of those Russian infantry were having to be repelled essentially hand-to-hand with grenades and small arms. That's a massively more costly way of defending defense lines in terms of Ukrainian casualties. The decision to withdraw from Avdiivka when it was made was entirely the right one, because it was becoming disproportionately costly to hold.
And the big question, are glide bombs going to win the war for Russia?
That will essentially still come down to 2 things. One, can Ukraine continue to mobilize and train enough people to replace losses? Currently the line is very thinly held because losses have been high and training and mobilization has not kept pace over the last 6 months. But also artillery ammunition. But ultimately the war seems to be being decided at the moment, one way or the other, by howitzer shells and barrels to fire them.
This is a video taken from a Ukrainian spy drone to the north of Avdiivka. It shows an American Bradley fighting one of Russia's best tanks, the T-90M Breakthrough. The Bradley manages to blind the T-90, causing it to lose control and crash. But this is not what should have happened. Let's go back. The T-90M is designed to destroy other tanks. It should be more than capable of taking out a Bradley. The Bradley is a battlefield taxi, designed to take troops into and out of the fight. So, how did it win? We're going to analyze this footage, delve into the archives, and speak to an expert to find out. This is a Bradley IFV, or Infantry Fighting Vehicle. America gave Ukraine 190 of these mean machines, which Kiev used to equip the 47th Mechanized Brigade. It was designed during the Cold War and first entered service in 1981, though these ones probably date back to the 1990s. And this is the T-90M Breakthrough, the most modern tank in use by the Russian army and, supposedly, its best. From the waist down, there isn't much new here. It's basically the same as the old T-72 tanks that Russia's been using since the Cold War. But up top, the tank is brand new and packed full of state-of-the-art kit, starting with its 125mm main cannon, which has been upgraded to fire more destructive shells. Compare that to the Brad's main weapon, which is a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun. The tank cannon is designed to punch through armor, reinforce concrete, and basically blow to bits anything that it might encounter on the battlefield. Whereas the Brad's gun is only really capable of taking out things like infantry and light vehicles, trucks and troop transports. Both the tank and the Bradley have light machine guns for close quarters fighting, which can be controlled from inside, so the crew doesn't have to get out and risk getting shot. And both are covered in explosive reactive armor, or ERA. These are blocks of explosives that are designed to go off when they're hit by enemy shells to deflect them away from the tank. Up here, the Bradley has two anti-tank rockets, so it can take down enemy armor if it has to, while the T-90 turret is covered in all sorts of sensors and cameras. The largest is the commander's main sight, which is known as the Falcon's Eye. It provides a wide view of the battlefield, gives him day and night thermal vision, a laser rangefinder to identify and lock onto targets, as well as a range of other sensors for the onboard targeting computer or fire control system, which is called Kalina. On the other side of the turret is the gunner's sight, the PNMT, which gives a separate day and night thermal view. Just behind that, a wind speed indicator feeds data from the mast to the fire control system, and cameras attached to the mast and the sides of the tank give the three-man crew a 360-degree view of the world outside. So let's see what happens when these two vehicles take each other on in combat. This is the town of Stepove, or what little is left of it, just to the north of Avdiivka. This video was taken in early January, when Ukraine's 47th Brigade were defending it against Russians who were trying to take the city. Here, a Bradley has found itself facing off with a Russian T-90M at very close range. The T-90 opens fire, but misses, before the Bradley drives up close and begins hitting it with rounds from its chain gun. You can see a few tracer rounds flying past the tank, as well as sparks when the turret and the hull are hit. The Bradley drives behind cover, just in time, as the tank fires a second shot, which seems to hit a nearby building. The Bradley keeps up the chain gun fire on the move, made easier by sensors which keep its gun locked on target. You can see a couple more tracer rounds, and the tank getting hit again here. It returns fire, but misses once again. The drone then pulls back to show us a wider view of the battlefield. Over here, a second Bradley vehicle is hiding, and it's going to take over fighting the tank in just a second. The first Brad is almost done, but manages to get off a few more shots before it goes. Suddenly, there's what seems to be a large explosion from the tank, with flaming debris going everywhere. But this probably isn't an explosion. The tank has likely fired its smoke canisters, which are designed to blind the Bradleys and stop their guns from locking on. As the first Bradley drives off, the second one takes up the attack. We know quite a lot about what happened next, because Commander Serhiy and his driver Alexander spoke to Ukrainian TV about it. Serhiy said they initially hit the tank with their armor-piercing rounds, but there was a problem, likely an ammo jam, and so they had to swap to the high-explosive rounds, which you can actually see happen on the video. At first, the gunfire from the second Brad looks exactly the same as the first, the odd tracer round and a flash anytime one of the rounds hits the tank. But then it changes, and there's a bigger flash anytime a bullet strikes anything, buildings, the ground, or the tank. This is the high explosive ammo, and this should really be where the fight ends for the Bradley. High explosive rounds are designed to take out infantry. They have next to no chance of penetrating the T-90's armour. But Serhiy has a trick up his sleeve. Instead of targeting the tank's hull, he goes for the delicate sights and sensors on top to blind the crew. Where did he learn this clever trick? He tells us himself.
Колись грав в комп'ютерні ігри, я вспомнив все, коротше, і як бити ті танки, і куди бити, бо, я мав його зупинити любою ціною. Із-за того, що в мене були проблеми з бронебійними, я просто почав його робити сліпим, щоб він звідти не...
Zoomed-in footage shows this strategy in action. Despite having a physical line of sight to the Bradley, the tank never fires back, suggesting his strategy was a success. A fire then starts close to the tank's main gun, and there is another explosion that looks similar to the smoke launchers. But this one comes from the wrong part of the turret and is probably one of the explosive armor plates cooking off, which means the heat of the fire has caused it to detonate. The tank is now in real trouble, and it can only try and hide behind cover as the Bradley keeps up the chain gun fire. When the drone pilot zooms in, we can see the turret has completely failed. It's spinning in circles while still on fire. Unable to navigate properly, the tank narrowly misses a telegraph pole before slamming into a tree. The crew escape from their disabled tank unhurt before the Ukrainians use a drone to finish the vehicle off. This may come as a surprise, but Ukraine is actually not the first time that Bradleys have faced off against Soviet tanks. The first was all the way back in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the American-led liberation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army. Though Russia wasn't involved in the fighting directly, Moscow was the Iraqis' main arms dealer, and so Saddam's troops were using Soviet tanks. Attacking them was a coalition led by the US, which had a huge amount of armour, including 1,700 Bradleys, which were taking part in their first combat deployment. The operation called for a huge armoured charge from Saudi Arabia into Iraq and then across into Kuwait to drive the Iraqis out. Perhaps the most important battle took place at 73 Easting, which has been dubbed the last great tank battle of the 20th century. There, hundreds of Bradleys and around 1,000 American Abrams tanks of the 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment faced off against Saddam's elite National Guard units in their Soviet T-72s. In one of the opening salvos of the battle, 2 Bradleys managed to take out 5 T-72 tanks using their TOW anti-tank launchers in the space of just a few minutes. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, with the Bradleys fighting alongside the Abrams, the 2nd Cavalry destroyed more than 170 Iraqi tanks and dozens of armoured vehicles. In return, they suffered a loss of just 1 Bradley, with 1 man killed and 12 injured. Desert Storm resulted in a swift and crushing Allied victory. Over the course of the operation, just 20 Bradleys were lost, only 3 of which were down to enemy fire. The other 17 were friendly fire. 12 more were damaged, 9 of them due to the enemy, and despite the Bradleys' role as scouts, they actually took out more Iraqi tanks than the Abrams. Overall, the Iraqi army lost 3,000 tanks, 2,000 armoured vehicles, and tens of thousands of men in just 100 hours. The Allies suffered only 147 casualties and a few dozen tanks destroyed. Bradley crews gave glowing reports of their vehicles once the fighting was done, praising them as both fast and lethal. Based on those reports, the US military went about improving the Brads, making them easier to spot so they didn't get shot so much by their own side, as well as making them easier to fix. These new versions, dubbed ODS-SA, which stands for Operation Desert Storm Situational Awareness, are the versions that Ukraine is thought to have been given. 3 decades ago, on the battlefields of Iraq, the Bradleys proved themselves superior to Soviet tanks. Putin now likes to brag that Russia's T-90M is the best tank in the world, but seeing one of them get beaten by 2 battlefield taxis that are 3 decades old makes you wonder whether that's really true. Here's what an expert thinks.
What we're seeing here is actually something we call disco turret head in the tank world, where the tank has been so badly bashed up, the crew probably seriously injured inside, have completely lost complete sort of spatial awareness, not knowing where they are. and the tank virtually out of control. It might be driving itself, but one of the vulnerabilities of the Russian tanks we've seen, particularly in Ukraine, that relatively small amount of hits they get, and then they pretty much go crazy. And as we're seeing there, that tank, that is the last action it'll see. What we're seeing here is a T-90 Russian tank, the most advanced one they have, being absolutely hammered by some Bradley infantry fighting vehicles with a 25mm Bushmaster cannon, which is a pretty small weapon to be shooting at a big vehicle like that. The T-90 is a very basic tank compared to a Challenger 2 or a Leopard 2 or an Abrams. It's got a good 125mm gun, but its protection is very lacking. Its explosive reactive armor, which it appears to have, doesn't seem to work, and it's very susceptible to these $500 drones. So likewise, Putin has also said that the experimental T-14 Armati tank, which is due to replace the T-90, is the best tank on the planet. But again, what we've seen of it, it's been incredibly vulnerable to virtually attack from everything. And I think, the Russians were synonymous with great tanks. In fact, probably the greatest tank in history, the T-34, which the Russians designed and developed in the Second World War, was what every other tank has built on. But it would seem that the T-34 was the height of Russian tank design and capability, because everything they've produced since then has been pretty poor and very vulnerable to even the lightest attack. It's reassuring for the Ukrainians with their Bradleys and their other kit that they know if they can get in range of Russian tanks, they can take them out. And the other key element is actually the way that the Russians use tanks. They've lost so much crew that the crews who are now in the T-90s and the T-80s that the Russians have left have virtually no training and can virtually do little more than drive in a straight line, and if they're lucky, actually fire the main armament. It takes a long time to become an effective tank commander. It took me 2 years to really master how to fight a Challenger 1 and then Challenger 2, and I've got thousands of hours on Challenger 1 and Challenger 2. And it's one thing just being able to fight the tank. The key thing is to be able to fight tanks together, what we call combined arms maneuver warfare. Now, that takes a heck of a long time. When I was preparing the 1st Royal Tank Regiment to do this, we had to do 2 years of training before we were deemed fit enough to go on the battlefield. Now, when we look at the Russians, most of their tank action is one tank at a time, as we've seen in this video here. What you need is at least 2 tanks working together to provide what we call mutual support. So as one tank moves, the other puts down fire so that the Bradleys can't actually hit it. But there is no sign at all that the Russians are doing it. Their skills are shocking as well. I'm yet to see a Russian tank with any camouflage on it, which seems extraordinary to me. And I think the fact that the crews are so inexperienced, when you see tank troops of 3 tanks or 4 moving around the battlefield, they almost seem to be tethered, one following the other, mainly because I expect it's only the officer who has a map in his tank. But it makes them really easy targets, very predictable, and they're always very close together, so they can be taken out very easily. So it's surprising to me. I thought the Russians would be far better, but they've got worse because they're having to replace their so-called experienced tank crews with new tank crews, and you just can't learn how to do this stuff in a couple of days. It takes weeks, months, if not years. Conversely, when we look at the Ukrainians, at the very start, they, would appear they were naive, but actually they weren't. They were just not trained. They weren't experienced. But over 2 years, they are gaining that experience. And the action we saw with those Bradleys, a number of Bradleys working together, synchronized, really shows that they're getting to grips with this armoured warfare. I've seen Bradleys for many years, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, and also in Afghanistan. These are really capable fighting vehicles, very well protected in armament terms, but also really pack a punch. Their 25mm Bushmaster cannon, although it's small in tank gun terms, It has a very, very high rate of fire. It has an armoured piercing shell, and as we're seeing, fairly easily defeating a T-90 tank. We've seen a lot of them on the battlefield in Ukraine, and although they're 30 years old, they are still really one of the best infantry fighting vehicles around, and have been improved all the time to have an anti-drone capability as well. So I think that is one of the key vehicles that they want to be in, want to fight in, and it's proving really effective. When it comes to tank warfare, actually nothing's changed. If we look at the first great tank battle in 1917 at Cambrai, when my regiment was formed, you basically had a steel vehicle with a big gun moving forward, and it had firepower, it had protection and mobility. But in those days, I as a tank officer would be out of the front of my tank with an ash plant checking that the ground was viable for the tank. Today in Ukraine, they have a drone doing that. Back in 1917, there would be a person in an air balloon looking for targets. Today in Ukraine, there is a drone. But though what we learned at Cambrai back in 1917 is exactly still what we learn in Ukraine. It's about working together. It's about tanks and infantry and artillery working together. It's about combined arms maneuver warfare. And so although we're over 100 years later, the tank really hasn't fundamentally changed. Things like drones are having a huge impact, and $500 drones are dropping $50 hand grenades through hatches of Russian tanks and blowing them up. We're very quickly learning how to counter that, but the basic premise of a steel vehicle moving rapidly over difficult terrain with firepower is exactly the same as it was 100 plus years ago. Now, I was in the army, for 35 years or so, and every year as a tank commander, I was told that the end of the tank, a bit like the end of the horse on the battlefield. But there is no signs from what we're seeing in Ukraine that the value of a tank used correctly in a combined arms environment is any less than it was at Cambrai in 1917. We in the British, we had Challenger tanks and Warrior armoured fighting vehicles. The Warrior is very similar to the Bradley, actually has a slightly bigger gun, more effective. And certainly the Warriors were very effective against the T-72s, T-55s that the Iraqis had. And I understand the Bradleys were as well. And it really shows the difference between Russian armoured vehicles and Western armoured vehicles. When we look at Western kit against Russian kit, we know the Russians have loads of it. And there is a quality and quantity. Mass is important. But when it comes to technology and the state of the kit, that is also really important. The Russians have lost, it depends what figures you go by. But if the British MOD are saying plus 4,000, then that can't be far wrong. Now, the Ukrainians have lost a great deal less than that. Of course, you can replace tanks, but actually you can't replace the crews. The crews are the sort of crocodile nearest a canoe. They take time. But not only with tanks that we've seen it, but a whole host of other equipment, fighter jets, attack helicopters, and also anti-tank weapons. So I think the thing that is important here is if we can get enough Western kit to the Ukrainians in time, then they should prevail. Because, as far if we look at it in a numbers game, a Challenger 2 tank is probably worth 10 Russian tanks. And if you use that metric, then Ukrainians could gain that mass that is required for an effective combined arms maneuver. For combined arms warfare to be effective, you need tanks, you need infantry armoured fighting vehicles, you need artillery, you need attack helicopters, and you need air power fighter jets all working together to be able to achieve an advantage. Now, I'm getting more confident that this is possibly likely to happen. Conversely, the Russians, although they have made a bit of ground recently, it's been at the cost of, over 1,000 dead a day around Avdiivka. And we know also they're using crude chemical weapons in the form of CS gas, which is illegal under the Geneva Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. That's the only way they can move forward. So as the Russians are getting worse, the Ukrainians are getting better. And that gives us some hope for the future that actually Ukraine can start pushing these Russian invaders back.
This is one of 31 Abrams M1A1 tanks given to the Ukrainians by the US and used to equip the 47th Brigade. The M1A1 entered service in 1986. It weighs around 60 tons, is powered by a gas turbine engine that'll run on pretty much any kind of fuel, and is armed with a 120mm main cannon. It is coated in Chobham composite armour, which provides some of the best protection in the world to the crew of 4 who sit inside the turret. At the back of the turret is an armoured compartment where the ammunition is stored, which is separated from the turret by blast doors. That means even if the ammo explodes during battle, the crew will be protected. And on top of the compartment are blowout panels, deliberately weak sections which pop off and vent the blast away from the crew. The Russians claim this tank was spotted by soldiers of the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade who used a Piranha FPV, or first-person view drone, to disable it. There are 2 kinds of Piranha drone, the Piranha 7, which is smaller, and the Piranha 10, which is larger. Both are made up of a quadcopter drone with a top speed of 140 km per hour. The Piranha 7 can carry a load of up to 2.5 kilos and has a limited range because it only contains a small battery. The Piranha 10 can carry a load of up to 4.5 kilos and has an extended range because of its larger battery and more powerful propellers. Both are controlled using multiple radio frequencies which the pilot can change in flight, making it very difficult to jam. The drones only cost about $500 each, which makes them ideal for destroying high-value targets like a $4.3 million Abrams tank. The Russians claim this tank was hit by one Piranha before they started filming, likely targeting the engine or the tracks, which has disabled it. In military speak, this is an M kill, or a mobility kill. It means the vehicle cannot move, but is probably repairable if it can be rescued. What we're about to watch is the Russians trying to convert that M kill into a K kill, or a catastrophic kill, meaning the tank would be out of action for good. How are they going to do it? By flying another drone into it. The Russians have clearly done their homework, because the second drone hits the Abrams on the back of the turret. The blast causes the ammo to start cooking off, which means the heat from the fire is setting off the shells. But the ammo compartment armour keeps the blast confined to the back of the tank, and the blowout panels pop off here and here, venting the explosion upwards. Because of these safety features, all the crew inside the tank made it out alive. And even though the Abrams catches fire, it doesn't explode. The Russian mission to turn the M kill into a K kill ends in failure. This took place in late February and was initially dismissed as a one-off, but barely a week later, 2 more Abrams were lost in the exact same place in almost the exact same fashion. For a tank that is supposed to be world-leading, that seems like a problem. To really get a sense of how the Abrams is faring in Ukraine, we need to dive into the archives and compare it to other tanks. Russia has mostly relied on old Soviet T-72s to fight this war, and they've not handled it well. Ukraine claims to have destroyed around 7,000 of them, and when they go, they can really go. In case you were wondering, this is what a K-kill looks like. This is a legacy of the T-72's Soviet past. When these tanks were built during the Cold War, the USSR had an army numbering in the millions. It needed a lot of tanks, so they had to be cheap and easy to make. The T-72 was the result. It weighs around 40 tons, much lighter than Western tanks, and has a crew of just 3, which means it is much smaller as well. The 4th crew member has been replaced by a piece of kit called an autoloader, which automatically reloads the tank's 125mm cannon after each shot. Because of the way the autoloader works, the spare ammunition is stored directly underneath the crew and inside the turret. If a T-72 is hit and the blast sets off the ammo inside the tank, the result is a catastrophic explosion. That results in these huge turret tosses, otherwise known as the jack-in-the-box effect. Russia's newer tanks, like the T-80 and T-90, fare slightly better, but not by much. They generally have better armor than the older T-72s, but are still based on the original Soviet designs, which means the ammo is still stored in and around the crew. Western tanks are by no means indestructible, but they do a much better job of protecting the men inside. America's Abrams, Britain's Challenger, and Germany's Leopards are also products of the Cold War. Their designers knew they could never match the Soviets for numbers, so to stand a chance, their tanks would have to take multiple hits and keep going. And if they were destroyed, it was important that at least the crew survived to fight another day. Compared to Soviet tanks like the T-72, the Abrams and Challenger are bigger and a lot heavier, but that's because they are better protected. Aside from features like blowout panels on the Abrams, both of these tanks use a specialist kind of armour called chobham armour. This is made of a composite of different materials layered together. Exactly which ones is a closely guarded secret, but it is thought to offer some of the best protection in the world. The Leopards use a different kind of composite, which is not quite as good but still offers high levels of protection. Like the Abrams, the Leopard and Challenger have 4 crew members, including a loader. The ammo is also stored in a blast-proof container at the back of the turret rather than underneath the crew. This is meant to stop the entire tank exploding in the event the ammo compartment is hit. Despite being heavier than Russia's tanks, advanced engines make them faster and therefore harder to hit. High-tech targeting systems mean their main guns can lock onto targets and fire on the move, so they don't have to slow down or stop, which would make them vulnerable. That is good news for Ukraine, because it has saved the lives of many tank crews which Kiev cannot afford to waste, and potentially the tanks themselves, provided they can be towed off the battlefield. For that reason, the Abrams looks like it does indeed have a place on the battlefields of the future. Here's what an expert thinks.
So here we have footage of the drone hitting the back of the Abrams, which is its most vulnerable point, and it's hit it right on top of the ammunition compartment, which sits at the back of the turret in an armoured compartment. And it's got blowout panels on the top, which you can see in effect there, so that if the ammunition is hit and it cooks off and causes that kind of fireball, it's directed upwards away from the crew inside the tank rather than towards them. But this, of course, only works if the armoured compartment is sealed. So if you're caught as you're opening the compartment to load the gun, you might be in trouble, as the explosive force can be directed within the turret. But there it looks like it did its job and saved the crew. The Abrams itself, it is one of the best tanks out there, but I think before you start looking at the Abrams in particular, you've got to set the scene on tank warfare in general. And I think there's not many examples in the last few decades of large-scale conventional conflict where we can really see how the tank fares on the battlefield. And the few examples that we do have show that the tank is by no means invincible, and nor is it designed to be. So if you go back to 1973 with the Yom Kippur War, where the Israelis were fighting the Egyptians and the Syrians, that war lasted about a month, and the Israelis lost 1,000 tanks, and the Egyptians and Syrians lost 2,200 tanks over the course of the month of fighting. And one of the reasons that the Israelis lost so many tanks was the Saga wire-guided anti-tank missile, which a lot of people at the time had similar conversations with drones today. So this was a very small weapon that an infantryman could carry on his back into battle, lie down, and using a little joystick and a wire could guide it onto the tank, and it took the Israelis by surprise and resulted in a lot of heavy tank losses. Not many years after, you've got the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and that conflict has a few similarities to today with sort of very static front lines, trench warfare, and there were thousands of tanks lost on both sides in that conflict as well. So I think in general, we're just not used to seeing this kind of fighting, and that we've been taken a bit by surprise at how many tanks have been destroyed, but there's nothing particularly unusual with that. So I guess that brings us onto the Abrams, which is one of the best tanks out there. But one thing that we should bear in mind is the Ukrainians were given the M1A1 variant, which is the older variant. So the Abrams was first designed and entered service in the 1980s, when drones were not much of a problem, and the Americans were thinking about designing a tank to fight the Soviets on the sort of plains and rolling hills of West Germany. So it's got a lot of armor on the front, where you'd expect the enemy to be coming at you, but on the top it has not got as much armor. I think it's about 25 millimeters on the top of the turret and 38 millimeters on the top of the hull where the driver sits. So these are two quite vulnerable points. So if a weapon strikes you there, you are a bit more vulnerable. It's just that when they were designed, this is not where they were expecting weapons to hit them.
It's not just Abrams tanks that are getting killed in Ukraine. It seems no tank is safe anymore.
Figures aren't easy to get, but from open source information, because the Russians and Ukrainians have very high claims of what they've destroyed of each other's equipment. But taking the Oryx database, which is a team that looks through what you can visually confirm through videos or pictures as being destroyed, we can see that the Ukrainians, over the 2+ years of fighting, have lost around 800 tanks, either destroyed, damaged, or captured, and the Russians have lost around 3,000 tanks. So for the Ukrainians, about 1 tank a day, for the Russians, 3.5 to 4 tanks a day, which I think tells you a lot about the design features of Russian tanks. They're a lot lighter, designed more for mobility and firepower than for protection, which is a sort of inverse philosophy to a lot of Western tanks. So looking at the Western tanks that Ukraine has received so far, they've only received 130 of what you would probably consider modern Western tanks. So those are your Leopard 2s, your Challenger 2s, and your Abrams. They received several hundred sort of upgraded Soviet-era tanks from NATO countries, but these 130 modern Western tanks are the best protected. And so far, they have lost 19 of those destroyed and 22 damaged or abandoned, which I think is actually, considering the scale of the fighting and the intensity and the prolonged nature of the fighting, quite impressive that only that many have been lost, especially if you look back to when Ukraine was conducting its counteroffensive. They were attacking against heavily fortified with mines, tank obstacles, well-prepared artillery fire zones, and they were doing this without air superiority and without artillery superiority. And despite that, for being on the offensive for several months, the fact that only 40 tanks of the Western tanks given to them so far have been taken out of action, and some of those will have been recovered and repaired of the damaged and abandoned tanks, I think that's testament to the protective features of Western tanks in Ukraine.
Which begs the question, why is anyone still using tanks if they keep getting blown up?
The combination of firepower, mobility, and protection that the tank offers simply can't be replaced. No other platform can do the same thing. Till a system comes along that can do that, both sides will be desperately trying to get as many as they can. Because you've seen what the drones and artillery and mines can do to a tank when they hit it. But if you imagine what kind of effect that firepower has on much less heavily armored vehicles, whether it's the American Humvee or the Russian BMP, you're a lot more vulnerable, and it's only the tank that can afford you that unique combination of firepower, mobility, and protection.
If no army is about to give up the tank, then what I wanted to know is whether there's anything tank crews can do to better protect themselves.
The massive benefit of a FPV drone is that if you attach an anti-tank weapon to it, you can literally sort of guide it around to the very specific point of the tank that you most want to hit. And there's not much at the moment that tankers can do about it in Ukraine. For stopping drones, electronic warfare is one option. Whacking some jammers onto the tank is one way of interfering with either the drone's targeting systems, if it's a loitering munition, or the communication between the drone pilot several miles away and the drone itself for an FPV. You can try and jam them, although again, as part of the measure-countermeasure, the drone pilots themselves can switch frequencies and try and evade the jamming. You could add extra armor to the weak points. This is what the Swedes did with the Leopard 2s that they gave to Ukraine, and only one of those so far has been destroyed, although several have been hit. The problem with adding extra armor to the top of the tanks is that it adds a lot of weight. And in Ukraine, that's not ideal given the sort of muddy pictures we're used to seeing of tanks getting bogged down after it's been raining. These things are already very heavy, sort of 40, 50, 60 tons. So adding armor is not the route you would want to go. But beyond that, there's also active protection systems, which are a relatively new feature of tanks. Not many have them, but people are very quickly exploring options. And these could include sort of hard kill measures. So you've got a couple of small radars on the top of the tank and a couple of sort of projectile firing systems, which basically fire a shotgun shell equivalent at an incoming threat and either try and destroy it, disrupt it, or if it's a tandem warhead that's coming in, to try and make it prematurely fire. to protect the tank. The problem with an active protection system is they're quite expensive, and it probably adds something like 25 to 50% of the cost of the tank. But if you want to protect it, that's something that I think most people are going to have to do. The issue with the current generation of active protection systems is they're not really designed to deal with drones, but people are already looking into how they can be adapted to face that threat.
And sometimes it isn't about the tank itself, so much as how the tank is being used.
Ideally, your tanks would be used as part of a combined arms effort, working in tandem with other elements of your land forces, but also your air forces as well. The artillery and air power can protect the tank from infantry and drone operators and enable it to work as effectively as possible. And I think one of the reasons why it wasn't supported in the footage we saw is this lack of ammunition. The other problem is the types of vehicles available to support wouldn't be able to do much. They'd be sitting ducks. They've not got the kind of range or protection that the tank does, and they would be very vulnerable to drones. Whereas a lot of Western countries at the moment are now looking into what kind of vehicles can be sent in with tanks and other mechanized formations to protect them from the drone threat. So there's an increased emphasis these days on short-range air defense vehicles, or SHORAD, or very short-range air defense vehicles, which is VSHORAD. And we used to have a lot of these during the Cold War to face off against low-flying attack aircraft or helicopters. And one of these you can see is the German Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, which the Ukrainians do have a few of, and they've been using to good effect against drones. But I think at the moment they're mostly being used to protect critical infrastructure from the Shahed drones. Whereas if they could be on the front line, then they would be able to protect the tanks. And the Americans and others in the West are very aware of this problem and are designing a new generation of SHORAD, mobile SHORAD platforms. The Americans very recently ordered 144 SHORAD variants of the Stryker armored personnel carrier as a stopgap measure while they think about what the best approach moving forward is.
And now for the big question. Does William think tanks have a place on the battlefield of the future?
Yes, they absolutely certainly do. It's just about making sure that they're as good as they can be moving forward.
What we're looking at here is the world's longest sniper rifle, in action in Ukraine. We think these guys are from the Ghosts of Bakhmut sniper unit. The rifle they're carrying is the Snipex Alligator, and it is huge. But snipers are supposed to be stealthy, so what's the point of a rifle so big it takes two men to carry it? We're going to examine this clip, delve into the history of rifles like this, and speak to an expert to find out. At 6 foot 6 inches without a silencer, it is bound to be taller than the person shooting it. It weighs almost 30 kilos, that's 66 pounds, and it fires a 14.5 by 114 millimeter .57 caliber round that was originally used in Soviet heavy machine guns. It's fed by a box magazine, and it has a bolt action, which makes it more accurate. To stop the recoil taking the sniper's head off, it has a muzzle brake on the end of the barrel, a front bipod, a rear monopod, a padded shoulder rest, and a padded cheek rest. Down here is a carrying handle to make it easier to transport, and the barrel can be detached so it can fit inside vehicles. In this video, a sniper and his spotter are taking part in a covert mission thought to be somewhere near Bakhmut in September last year. As the footage starts, you see the sniper pushing the bolt into place, loading a bullet into the chamber. He takes his time to pick his target, using dials to adjust his scope. At this distance, he will need to carefully take account for things like wind, which may push the bullet to the left or the right of his target. And he'll also need to take into account gravity, which will drag the bullet downwards and cause it to fly in an arc rather than a straight line. And perhaps even the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth which, in the northern hemisphere, would push the bullet slightly to the right over extreme distances. Though, in truth, this effect is very subtle. Once he's happy, the sniper opens fire. But he doesn't seem all that pleased with his first attempt. So he reloads, finds his target a second time, and after a few tense moments, he fires a second shot. He waits a few seconds while the bullet is in the air and then says, the target is down. Now he and his comrade pack up the rifle and make their getaway. A second piece of footage shows them carrying the rifle back to a truck, which is waiting nearby. They load the rifle into the back before both of them jump in to keep it secure, and then they take off. This is how the Ghosts of Bakhmut sniper unit operated for months in 2023, after the city fell to Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries. Led by a sniper whose codename is Ghost, their mission was to make the occupation of the city unbearable for the Russians. Ghost explained that they would ride vehicles into battle before jumping off and walking to a sniping spot they had picked out for themselves. Generally, that was a field somewhere overlooking Bakhmut. Once there, they would set up their rifles and wait for up to 16 hours for any Russians unlucky enough to wander into their crosshairs. As of October 2023, the unit's body count was 500 Russian soldiers. Not a single one of their snipers was killed in return. And that was the last time we heard from Ghost. At this point you might be thinking, well, that's all very impressive, but what's the point of a sniper rifle that's so big 2 men have to carry it? After all, snipers are supposed to be stealthy, and good luck sneaking up on anyone whilst lugging that thing around. And you would be right, except in this case it doesn't matter, because this rifle's main targets aren't people. The Alligator is known as an anti-materiel rifle, and that's because it's supposed to shoot things like armoured vehicles, truck transports, radar arrays, parked jets, even helicopters. From a mile away, the Alligator is powerful enough to put a bullet straight through the armour of a Russian BTR troop transport, and you don't need to be particularly stealthy when you're taking out loud, large vehicles. Not that the rifle can't kill people, in fact, it's very good at it. Because it's firing such a large bullet with such a lot of force behind it, the Alligator's effective range is 1.25 miles, but Ukraine has used it to kill Russian soldiers well beyond that. In November 2022, one sniper claimed to have hit a target at 1.68 miles. That was the second longest sniper kill in history, at least until a different Ukrainian sniper used a similar rifle, called Horizon's Lord, to take out a man 2.3 miles away. And again, you don't have to be all that stealthy if the men you're shooting at are too far away to see or hear you. Anti-materiel rifles date back to the First World War, when they were created shortly after the Allies invented the tank, which makes sense when you think about it, since that's the thing they were supposed to kill. The T-Guerre rifle was based on the much smaller Mauser and fired a 13mm bullet that was enough to go through the relatively thin armour of tanks like the British Mark I. Similar rifles were also used in the Second World War by the Soviets, like the PTRS-41. But these were designed to be used over relatively short distances, and by the end of the Second World War, tank armour was way too thick for them to penetrate in any case. So the concept largely fell out of fashion, at least until an American photographer named Ronnie Barrett came up with the idea of creating a large caliber sniper rifle in the 1980s. The story goes that Barrett was photographing US troops operating .50 caliber machine guns when the idea came to him. He initially struggled to get the weapon made because it seemed like there wasn't a market for it, but he eventually found a machinist who was willing to produce his designs. In 1982, the first Barrett .50 cal sniper rifle was produced, and it very quickly sold out. At first, mostly to sport shooters.
But the CIA soon placed an order to equip the Afghan Mujahideen, elements of which would later become the Taliban, who were fighting the Soviets at the time.
The first national armed forces to adopt it were the Swedes, before the US Marines decided to buy some. Now, the rifle is used by more than 50 countries, and even those which don't use it have created versions of their own. While these rifles have produced some truly incredible distance kills against soldiers, their main purpose is still to take out vehicles. They can't kill tanks anymore because the armour is just too thick. That job has instead been taken over by anti-tank rockets. But rockets are expensive and difficult to produce, and they're not worth wasting on other, less well-armoured vehicles like trucks and troop transports. And that's where the rifle comes in. Using nothing more than a few cheap bullets and the skill of the sniper, they can take out vehicles potentially worth millions of dollars. That's useful no matter which army you're in. But for Ukraine, which has been short of missiles since Russia invaded and is still struggling, that is a huge advantage, particularly when you're fighting a country like Russia, which has more vehicles in its army than any other nation on Earth.
But do huge sniper rifles really make a difference in today's warfare? We asked Tony Neophytou, the South African gunsmith who designed an anti-materiel rifle, for his reaction.
Obviously, he's just chambered a cartridge. He's adjusting the scope, and he's going to expect a huge muzzle blast. That's what I'm very sure of. He's probably dialing the scope in for the distance, which is very important. you've got to have a laser rangefinder or some means of knowing at least where you are in terms of range to quite a good level of accuracy to be able to hit the target. And that can jump around quite dramatically in a combat situation from 300 to 1,300 meters in an instant. So being able to change the scope very quickly and accurately is important. There's fire shot. A silencer of some sort, especially on a weapon of this type, is extremely important to minimize the signature of the weapon and its position. Since the muzzle blast is so huge and easily visible, it is a big disadvantage. So having a muzzle device of some sort to minimize that will be very advantageous. What I find strange about this particular one, from what I understand, is the barrel is not quickly and easily detachable. And I think the weapon weighs in the region of about 25 kilograms, which makes it seriously unwieldable. For example, on the NTW, the barrel was very quickly detachable, and at least it could be broken down into two parts that one individual could carry each, whereas in this case, exfiltrating or moving out of where you are becomes quite an issue. But the same would apply to a mortar crew. So it depends on the tactical situation and how these things are being used.
The first thing I asked him was what makes an anti-materiel rifle different from a regular rifle.
They were not designed to shoot individual people. They were designed to shoot what they call materiel targets. Any vehicles, radar installations, aircraft, helicopters, any kind of material would be a suitable target for something like this. So they're not expressly designed for pinpoint accuracy in trying to hit an individual at long range. That is why they use the larger calibers that they do, so they can inflict damage and have some kind of armor penetration to some degree. They never will be an anti-tank weapon at all. Even during the First World War, and especially during the Second World War, weapons like this Steyr, the solid turn 20mm, the Boy's anti-tank rifle became obsolete very quickly and early on in the war. The armored vehicles became much too thick to penetrate, but they still retained a usefulness. So they were very often used in much larger numbers than one thinks. If you look at the Eastern Front, the Russians used the PTRS and the PTRD 14.5 very widely and continued to use it throughout the war because there were many vehicles, trucks, and lighter vehicles that were very vulnerable to this kind of weapon. As the war grinds on anywhere, those sophisticated anti-tank missiles and such like will be kept for the purpose for which they were designed and not wasted on lesser targets. And that is where a weapon like this could be quite useful.
Next, I wanted to know what kind of targets exactly an AMR would be shooting at.
The juiciest targets would be these rocket launchers, logistics vehicles, and radar installations that are mobile.
How about helicopters or jets?
It would be a rare occasion to hit a helicopter in the air, and unless you were by luck in absolutely the right place and the right time. But as an anti-air weapon, I don't think it would be very viable at all. It's such an unwieldy thing that there's no way you could bring it to bear in a quick fashion very quickly at all.
But if they were on the ground?
Absolutely lethal, for sure. Absolutely.
And even though they're not designed for it, AMRs can take out troops at very long distances. I wanted to know from Tony what made them so lethal at long range.
Well, I think they're powerful enough in terms of the energy that they have. For example, the 14.5 caliber has the same energy at 1,000 meters that the common Browning 50 has at the muzzle. So that gives you an indication of the kind of power that they have. The accuracy of these things is nowhere near what an anti-personnel rifle is. The accuracy is much lower. So I think these long-range hits with this type of weapon, I think luck has a lot more to do with it than one thinks, truly. You know, hitting a small target at 1,700, 2,200 meters is extremely difficult. Getting your range sorted out, and the further the range becomes, the higher the angle of the drop of the bullet, it becomes very difficult. It's not a repeatable thing in the sense that you can lie down and consistently hit something in that sort of range. So I think with experience and depending on the scenario, if the guys manage to fire a couple of shots and see where they fall and where they land, he can maybe walk them up onto the target. It's not a very precise science. It takes a lot of experience and dedication. So certainly you can hit at long range, but hitting a small target like a human-sized target would be very, very difficult. I think luck has a lot more to do with it. I think the NTW was reported as having struck someone at, I think, 2,400 meters in the DRC. That was the longest kill with a 14.5. But I think that as well was a bit of luck.
So, what is it like to actually use a rifle like this? And how easy is it to hit a target at long range?
I think the big trick is the scope. Are you correctly zeroed in to start? Unless you correctly dialed in to start with and very accurately dialed in, it's very difficult to extend that to a further range because the areas just become bigger and bigger. You've got to adjust the scope so that it correlates to the point of impact of the bullet. And usually the scope will allow you to do that at a start distance of 100 meters, for example. So at least you can dial in quite quickly and accurately and know where you are. So when you suddenly move up to 1,000 meters, you will know what the ballistic performance of that cartridge, whatever cartridge it is you're using, and you can dial it up on the scope. Then 16 clicks up will be 1,000 meters and 23 clicks up will be 1,300 meters and so on. So that is where the real skill level becomes important.
What Tony's referring to here are wheels on the scope that allow the sniper to adjust the range, physically clicking up and down to make it shorter or longer.
To simplify things, for example, on the ATW, I had a ballistic range drum under the scope that was very accurately calibrated from 300 to 2,400 meters. So if you zeroed the scope correctly at the short range, you could dial it up very quickly and instantaneously and come back as well, without having to fiddle and be confused with all these odd numbers that scopes normally are with. So the skill level with a normal rifle like that, Snipex, the Alligator, is the guy really has to understand what's going on with his scope, how it actually operates, for him to be able to accurately dial in the distance. But there's another guess factor as well, and that's called wind, which is a much bigger factor than most people think, because there's no adjustment on the scope that automatically allows you to dial the wind out. So that is dependent on his experience. He's got to be able to read the conditions, and you can imagine how difficult that is at extended ranges. And the wind is often blowing much harder out in the open than people think. You know, sometimes at a distance of 1,500 meters, it can blow a 14.5 projectile off by the length of a bus. So it gives you an idea of how good you have to be at being able to spot your shots and compensating very, very quickly for that. And there's another factor as well. It's called mirage. In high temperature conditions, mirage can also affect you. So unless a soldier or a sniper is properly trained to read those conditions, it becomes very difficult to actually hit something at long range.
Mirage is the shimmer that distorts the way hot objects appear, like a road in summer, which looks like there's water resting on it, when in fact there isn't. Since Barrett created the first AMR, almost every military in the world has built one. I wanted to know why.
It's quite a low-cost deterrent. For example, in a mountainous area where you might have some insurgents and so on, and you'll have bunkers to keep an eye out, an anti-material rifle could be quite useful in that you could fire across valleys and have some effect without firing expensive missiles. The costs of the whole system compared to these other things, you can't waste an expensive guided missile of some kind on a suspected something going on out at a long distance. So it has some usefulness. I was actually surprised at how many have been sold, you know, because I have a good experience with the unwieldiness of these things, and they're really heavy and awkward to move around. So again, I would imagine in certain cases where you've got a base protection of some sort, or mountain passes to protect or such like, they could be quite useful in that sort of scenario. You can't see them as a tactical mobile weapon in the same sense that an assault rifle is, or an ordinary sniper rifle.
What does Tony think of the alligator rifle based on what he's seen?
I find it surprising that it weighs as much as it does. If you consider the Russian PTRD, I think it was the single-shot Second World War rifle, it looked very simple and like a piece of pipe, but it was a lot cleverer than people think. That weighed only 17 kilograms. It didn't have a scope, so obviously its range was limited. In the case of the alligator, it's 25 kilograms. So I just wonder why it's as heavy as it is. I don't think they have a very efficient recoil system on it, from what I can see. One of the big problems with a rifle like that is eye relief on the scope. In other words, the distance of the scope from your eye becomes a bit of a problem because of the recoil. So either you've got to mitigate the recoil or have a scope with a long enough eye relief. That means that the distance of the scope from your face, the further it can be, the more violent the recoil can become. So I think in the case of the alligator, it's a normal scope, probably about a 3-inch or what do we say, about 75 millimeter eye relief. So you need the weight of the scope of the gun to be able to control it properly, so it doesn't hurt you. And also, the heavier any rifle is, the less it recoils. It might have a bit of a recoil mitigation in the buttstock to reduce the recoil a little. And usually most of the recoil is taken out by a muzzle brake. That's probably the reason why it's 25 kilograms. And it can't be taken down, from what I can gather. The barrel can't be removed quickly. So a 25 kilogram item, you can imagine, is not such an easy thing. You can move it maybe 50 meters, but beyond that, you're going to be done.
And how about the rifle's destructive power?
14.5 has, I think, over 30,000 joules of energy. A half-inch Browning, 50 Browning, has got about 16,000 joules. So you can see the amount of energy that a 14.5 has is really, really huge. It can penetrate 30 millimeters of RB500 armor plate at 100 meters, quite easily. 30 millimeter armor is quite thick, believe me. So that shows you that the thing is really, really powerful. I think things like BTR would be vulnerable, especially from the side. I think 14.5 will punch holes through it quite easily. And that class of earlier generation APCs would be very vulnerable to this. They can also inflict damage to the sensors on a vehicle. You know, it's not so easy to do that. But if you shoot at the frontal aspect of the vehicle, there's all sorts of vision blocks and thermal images and sighting systems that can be damaged with it.
And now the big question. Does Tony think there's a use for huge sniper rifles such as this one in modern warfare?
In an urban environment, you could dump shots through windows and certain key locations at longer range and so on. If you deploy behind the troops which are moving forward, they can provide cover of some accurate cover that's maybe has less collateral damage. I've noticed in the countries that have been sold to, their requirements have been different, each one of them. You know, they bought them for different reasons. So it depends very much on each individual and what their problems are and how they try to solve them.
That's where this tape stops, but we'll be back to play you through another episode of War on Tape. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want more videos like this in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.